Hi and welcome everyone to this episode of Breakpoint. The topic for today is mastering application threat modeling at scale. Our guest for today is Tony Uvi. He's the CEO and founder of VerSprite Security and the author of Risk-Centric Threat Modeling and the PASTA framework.
In security, I can't ensure that I'm going to have zero risk.
Are there any cases where you realize that this cannot be automated definitely?
Because otherwise, traditionally, what we would do is we would go into a war room. We would have a huge whiteboard, and we would talk about what components are talking to what, under what protocols, under what privilege model, etc. Right?
If that level of visibility is present, I'm sure it will also be able to figure out. Welcome to Breakpoint Security Podcast, folks. Join us as we explore the fascinating world of smart security teams and their cutting-edge security and engineering practices. We'll share fun and engaging stories about clever optimization techniques that scale your defenses and also keep your data safe. Tune in and be a part of the conversation where exciting innovation meets real-world application in cybersecurity. Welcome to Breakpoint, Tony.
Thank you, Neelu. Appreciate and honored to be here.
So how are you?
I'm doing great. It's Saturday morning. It's nice and sunny here in Hotlanta, but really excited to talk a little bit more and share some insights on introducing threat modeling in enterprises that are thirsty for building out threat modeling programs. And again, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's also a pleasure for me. The fact that you came up with the PASTA framework yourself, you're one of the founders for that, and you've done a lot of work will mean a lot for the audience. Particularly in the recent past, we have seen that while the threat modeling as a concept has been there for a while, for a very long while, it's only recently that I am seeing that a lot of organizations are, trying to now think and have realized that, it's to start early is much better. So there was an entire wave of shifting left, and then everybody realized that once you find threats in the design phase, how much cheaper it can be in the entire development lifecycle to address the security issues. And that has started showing in the requests or the demand for threat modeling in general in industry.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's been a hot topic and a topic that's been proliferating for quite some time steadily over the past couple of years. When Marco and I co-authored PASTA or Risk-Centric Threat Modeling, the book in 2015, we saw a growing need to prove that there's a problem when developing products. And so we're both risk kind of nerds. And he was working as an SVP in London for a very large FI. And I was working for a Fortune 50 organization then. But we basically decided to introduce a methodology that was going to be a true step-by-step process, make it simple, something to follow. And now in 2024, nearly 10 years later, after the book was published, we definitely see a lot of demand for applying threat modeling in different types of SDLC methodologies, and scaling them, is always a challenge in any type of security effort. So, but it's interesting and great to see the increased appreciation and demand.
Yeah, it took 10 long years. So I was just smiling, thinking about, you would not have thought about it that way, that it would take such a long time for the industry to realize, but it's good that it's at least come now as a realization to most of the organizations today.
Absolutely. I mean, even taking something that's been around for such a long time, such as like risk management or vulnerability management, where we still have signature-based detection on a lot of what we see in terms of a vulnerability. We go back to the origin days and to see where we are now. Unfortunately, we still see a lot of the same mistakes, right? So it's very much a evolutionary and de-evolutionary process that, has a lot of contributing factors as to why that happens. Some of it's cultural, related to the company culture, related to politics, related to resource availability. But with threat modeling, hopefully, I think it's important to get the right principles in order early, because over time, like with anything in security management, there could be a lot of noise, a lot of marketing hype, and it can really steer a lot of practitioners in the wrong way. So you want to make sure you have a good regimented approach and understanding in terms of what is threat modeling, how to start, how to scale, and then how to make it to be sustainable.
Yeah, definitely. I think with a lot of, especially the modern application space being so different from what it was before, there are various tech stacks, there are different languages, there's a different, diverse environment. And especially for many of our listeners who might be new to this space, threat modeling is, just to call it out, is where you find out threats in the application or application design, and you figure out what can go wrong essentially in the application early on in the life cycle. But for a single, when we call it out for a single application, things are still okay because the complexity might be limited. But now, when you project it to the entire organization, that complexity actually amplifies many times. So, I have a bunch of things to ask in this regard. And the first thing I is for most of the beginners in the space of threat modeling who are new to threat modeling. Today, once they get their hands on an application, it will definitely be this sort of a modern application. What do you recommend for them to do threat modeling for these applications particularly? Like, what is the kind of framework you suggest them to follow? What is the approach? What is the methodology? Where do they start?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have to admit that I will be biased to PASTA, right? So the process for attack simulation threat analysis. However, I used to do debate in college and in high school. I'll be very objective. If you're just starting out in threat modeling and you are testing a decouple or modular application, right? Um, you want to keep it simple. Some of the times it's easy to be tempted to try to overscope an application to threat model. Keep it simple, keep the use cases or features that you want to threat model to be tight and to be most relevant to the main function of that particular application. It's very easy to overscope. And if you overscope, you're going to overcomplicate your threat modeling activity. And you're also going to probably maybe confuse your audience, your intended stakeholders in the threat modeling effort. So I would say start simple. Now, you also have to ask yourself, okay, well, if you're in an industry where security is a non-negotiable, maybe you are threat modeling an application in a nuclear power plant, as an example, or maybe as part of a military, deployment. Maybe there's an application that you have developed, your team has developed that has related to military, operations. Then I would say a security centric approach is best, right? Where you want to think of all the possible harms that could happen associated with threats. Now, most developers and product teams are not operating in such strict security confines. So I would suggest a risk centric approach. A risk centric approach says in security, I can't ensure that I'm going to have zero risk, right? There is a principle in finance where zero risk doesn't exist. In security, there's also no such thing as zero risk. So, what are the types of risks that are A, most likely to happen? B, have a greater incentive to happen, maybe from a threat actor. And C would be most prevalent because maybe my attack surface is very broad, or the deployment of my component in my application is right there on the edge of an internet accessible, network. And I would just use that as an approach to say, well, let me use simple conditions to say what is likely, and then associate weaknesses that I find, insecurities that I find that substantiate that threat. If it doesn't substantiate one, two, three threat assertions in my threat model, I move on. As an example, in the banking and financial industry, we oftentimes know that data is king, right? We have credit card data,
Yeah.
we have account data, but data is not king in the energy sector. Continuity is king, right? So
Yeah.
if you have energy distribution of resources and you have applications that are responsible for the distribution of that energy, then you want to make sure that your threat model really hones in on the threat against availability versus your threat model against financial applications, banking applications might prioritize the compromise of account data.
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, you're talking about risks on the basis of essentially threats which are more focused on your key business priorities rather than looking at it more theoretically, that, always thinking from one perspective, either data or control or something else.
Exactly. I mean, you hit the nail on the head because oftentimes in security, for whatever reason, we lose sight of the innate security knowledge that we have as humans, right? So I live in Atlanta, Georgia. You live in India, in Bangalore, right? So our security mechanisms that we have to protect our personal lives, our household lives, are innate to our thinking. We are influenced by intel that we get, incidents that happen in our neighborhoods, in our cities, and that affects how we change our security posture. We don't do this in security programs, especially in the AppSec area. We like to use a lot of frameworks, which is nothing wrong with that. But you want to look at the lens of risk from the context of like, why does this product exist? Is this product making my organization money? Is it making, 70% of overall revenue? And is availability or the lack thereof undermining or contributing to that revenue, right? You want to think in terms of why does this product exist? That the risk context will come from the rationale for why that product exists in the first place, not in terms of security vernacular.
Yeah, and I think while you were talking about it, it's very much of a first principles thinking, that you're thinking business first,
Right.
because business is the reason that you are even looking at threats in the first place. Could you briefly talk about pasta framework? I know that so there are, not everybody may be aware of the pasta framework, but if you could briefly explain how that works.
Absolutely. Pasta is a seven-stage methodology, true methodology in the sense that it tells you step by step how to get started. It's seven stages. The first three stages are really meant to be functional. So there's no hacking mindset, nefarious thinking in mind. It's like, what do I care about? Stage one. What am I running? Attack surface. Stage two. How does it all work together? Who's calling what under what privilege context, right? So it's all very functional understanding. Stages four, five, and six are now the exciting part. The four is like, okay, what threats against what I'm building actually exist? And substantiating that threat with intel. Stage five, what weaknesses would allow that threat to actually materialize, right? Otherwise, a threat is just idle, right? Like in any language, the translation of threat is just idle. It's a possibility of some harm, but the weaknesses might actually elevate the likelihood of that harm. And then we see stage six, which is attack. Now let's prove that the weaknesses that we found are actually viable in our application model. And so once we finish all those six stages, then we take a look and see what is the residual risk. At the end, what sort of attacks that were profiting from weaknesses in the environment are likely to happen, and which are, which actually did happen, which didn't happen in the testing. And so there you're left with the residual leftovers of these things happen, and you're able to message that really well. I think one of the challenges in any security activity, but let's take with threat modeling, is that people just simply look at threat modeling as like, okay, I have cloud security posture management. I have dynamic application testing. I have static analysis, code linting, and they're just like piling on activities. But threat modeling provides an opportunity to frame all of these things, contextually, right, in a model. So Pasta is the world's only risk-centric threat modeling methodology. It's seven stages. Each stage has multiple activities. Now, just to kind of complete that whole description, you can take pasta and make your own pasta, right? You can take stages one, four, and five and say, this is my pasta. You can say, I want to start with two, six, and seven, right? And this is my pasta. So you can make it
Oh, okay.
modular.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah, that's great. I would definitely urge everyone to go check it out. If you have not used it earlier, this can be quite useful because it's giving a very set idea of how to start. So there is a foundation I see that's building every time, because you understand it functionally very well, and then you move to stages where you understand the attacks very well, and then automatically by the time you reach a stage where you understand the controls, the attack, you know what's possible and what makes sense to your product. So.
Right. I will say too for the audience members, if they're interested, GitLab did a blog post on their own where they basically wrote a blog post and said, we started with threat modeling within the organization to develop better products, and we're using Pasta as a base. Now, what they wrote in that blog, if you Google GitLab Pasta threat modeling, you'll come up with the blog post, is that they took it and they made it their own, right? And that's the whole point. Um, Unlike other approaches, there's a common approach called STRI, which is just a mnemonic. It's not a methodology, it's a threat categorization. It's
Yeah.
simple, but you have to ask yourself when STRI was invented in 1990s, and then you look at the 2024, you still have the same threat categorization buckets. We have so much more additional threats that have evolved since the 1990s. So to be able to have just an immutable threat library doesn't make a lot of intellectual sense. You have to be able to evolve. In 20 years from now, the threat landscape is going to be different from what we've seen today. Maybe we'll have a way to finally mitigate injection based attacks or privilege escalation based attacks through, I don't know, AI defensive mechanisms, right? That are leveraging natural language processing and doing like data modeling of past attacks. And they're able to really shortcut that whole attack pattern. But there's going to be other types of attack patterns. If we use the same threat categorization from 2024 versus what's happening in 2064, that wouldn't make a lot of sense.
Right. So, talking of modern applications, since we started with that topic, many of the modern applications, not most, are built today using the agile development, methodology, and these are quite different from the traditional waterfall-based applications. The design phases are different. The velocity is different in the way that we approach it. Can you cite any differences in the way we can approach these two if you are in agile specifically? Because we're talking about modern applications.
Absolutely. I think, first off, it's the responsibility of security champion to be very well versed in terms of agile software development practices, right? And to be able to recognize that speed is a major difference between a linear waterfall approach versus a recursive approach like agile. So, you know, this is where scoping is a non-negotiable, right? You have in a development sprint different features that are being built, and you want to do a rapid threat model on the feature that's being developed, and you want to look at very simplistic characteristics of that feature that's being developed, mostly beginning with things like privilege, trust, um, overall information handling and credential token handling as some examples right there, right? So, as you can use those kind of four parameters as part of a development sprint to basically reconcile in a threat modeling effort. Do the threats that I have in my threat model for this application, are they exacerbated across those four different parameters, right? Trust, privilege escalation, mismanagement of like secrets or tokens and things like that. And so that way you can provide assurance that, okay, the way in which this particular feature has been developed, has been designed in an agile setting doesn't really exacerbate the threat in the threat model to go up, right? So those, it's important to be able to align the speed in which we turn around a threat model so that the architects and developers can, be more bake in some of those prescriptive, guidance on checking their the security context of the caller, for example, in an application functional workflow, call flow, so that they can make sure that it's a part of a repetitive development process, right? To always maybe do a CRUD exercise and see what the security context is of a caller and a function.
Yeah, there are a lot of things right there, and very nicely put. Um, but when we talk about, so while we have talked about a lot of things and in our own podcast with respect to security engineering, and this being a big aspect of finding threats, securing applications, in their development life cycle. And all of us keep talking about it. Let's start early. Let's have it in the design phase. Uh, Before we move to something like scale, right? Many times our first instinct is to automate, because automation has helped in so many ways, especially in security. That's how the entire DevSecOps space came up, and it has helped in a very efficient manner, especially dealing with thousands of issues sometimes, for in some of the cases like dependency checking and some of the other places. But when it comes to threat modeling, it is not that straightforward. There are some products in this space, but what are the challenges in automating threat modeling?
Yeah, so I'll try to be succinct on this one because this could be an entire podcast in and of itself. But
Itself.
um, I think that the challenge is don't get tempted by an easy road, right? There's a lot of products that are there's not a lot of products in threat modeling, but the ones that are there are advertising kind of like a quick one, two, three on how to get to understanding your attack surface or seeing what sort of threats are relatable. And oftentimes they're misrepresenting what is a threat and it's actually an attack pattern, or they're misrepresenting a risk and it's actually a weakness, right? And
Can you
so,
give an example to the
yeah, sure.
listeners?
So there's a lot of threat modeling activities that will name like these are your threats, and you look at the threat library that's developed, and some of them will be like SQL injection or you know some sort of like side channel attack or maybe doing like some sort of like impersonation attack, sandbox escaping, right? These are attack patterns, right? They're not threats. They're ways to do something. You might do sandbox escaping if you want to realize the threat of tenant hopping, right? If you're in a SaaS application, maybe you want to take a legitimate account and go into five other accounts, right? And so that's a threat that product managers, executives understand. But when you have a threat library that's saying, oh, sandbox escaping is a problem, you're losing half of your audience right there. So, but going back to your question on scaling, what does this have to do with scaling and automation? Is that it's easy to be able to take these attack patterns that are out there from like MITRE CAPEC or MITRE ATT&CK and then build this library and say, we built this threat library. Well, it's like, well, you've built an attack library. You haven't built a threat library, right? So you still have to map it to threats that are important against your product. Um, so I think that when it comes to automation, I think there's a lot of opportunity. The good news is that there's a lot of opportunity for automation if you're doing organic threat modeling within your organization. Some simple examples. So again, using like a risk-centric approach, stage one says, what do I care about? Well, if you're part of a large enterprise, and especially in the banking financial sector, those types of industries, they do something what's called a business impact assessment. And that is a very common approach for Fortune 500 type of organizations in the banking financial sector, where in that assessment, it defines this is what the application purpose, goal, objective is. And oftentimes, when you're doing software development too, you capture those sort of things in the system software development lifecycle. So to be able to interface with a system of record, it could be ServiceNow, it could be, Confluence, it could be wherever that BIA is housed, to extrapolate that. Now you have the objective to which your threat goes against, right? If my objective is to have an e-commerce site to sell a lot of, you know, computer monitors, then I want to make sure that the threats I build are going to negate those objectives, right? Because that makes the threat model and the threat library to be contextually important to the product owners, the business itself, et cetera. So you could take systems of record that have these sort of pieces of information and say, okay, now I can interface, have an API call to Confluence or to SharePoint or wherever this BIA is housed, extrapolate this information and store it into some level of a key value in a database. Um, and then use that as like, okay, as a condition to say, is this risky, right? Another simple example, a little bit more technical, is on attack surface. You may be using a continuous attack surface monitoring solution like a chasm tool. Maybe you don't. Maybe you just want to go on command line and do a depackage dump on all the packages that you're running, on the virtualized platform to see if there's threat advisories against it, right? How many Linux packages are you running in the environment, or JavaScript packages are you running in the environment? Do a dump, take that, use it as key values, do regex against threat intel feeds that you might be getting from Recorded Future, Mandiant, insert name, and then see if there's threat advisories. Because if you have a threat advisory on something in your attack surface and that campaign is relevant to your threat model, where one threat might be account compromise, another threat might be sabotage, then you can see if the advisories relating to your attack surface match the campaigns from the intel that you're getting, right? So those are simple ways where you can take information from one source, use it as a key identifier to be able to do parameterized search queries in other data sources, and then contextualize your threat model. What's unfortunately happening today is that, well, number one, that's not happening. And so a lot of people, simply said, and I think your audiences, Nilu and yourself, have probably seen this in the industry of security. There's a lot of companies that go to market because of a valuation model. They're just here to market something that has these promises, but without really thinking about solving the actual problem. So I'll leave it at that, because that's a whole separate rabbit hole right there.
Yeah, and an interesting one. Maybe I'll keep that for a future episode. But I was just thinking of some of the larger organizations for whom I myself have done this hands on. They have also tried to automate it. We've seen these products, and you're absolutely, bang on in saying that the context is missing. I think context is the biggest thing in threat modeling. One of the reasons why it has stayed manual for a very long time, because it's very easy to manually figure out the context in which a risk can become a priority for you. But for the tool, it's always, at least as of today, is always mapping it to something. It's like we do that in dependency checking, right? You have a public DB and you have a version, and then you map it, and then you think it is vulnerable, right? But then once you sit down and check, you know that this library is either not being called, or this method is not being called, or there are controls. There are so many things that go around it. And in an organizational context, like you rightly put, if there is a large organization where they need to automate it, for example, as a part of a program or otherwise, where you want threats to be detected much early on, the idea of threat library that you shared uh, is super fascinating, because and also quite nuanced, the difference from threat library and attack library, and what that means. Because they may have their own set of threads given their niche, their domain, their businesses, and then the tech stack and technology that they use. So there is a lot of that. There is, while I was thinking about it, there is also one aspect which I'm sure is not covered in most of the tools today, but maybe is possible. And I wanted to know your view on attack chaining. So many times when you have a real attack, you can have two, three different vulnerabilities that led to a single big attack, which in
Right.
itself wasn't that severe. So if you were to rate them separately, that'll not be a big deal, because you know that not much is possible. But when you look at threats, can there be something like that? Can that kind of context also be built if you have enough knowledge of the system?
Absolutely. Yeah. Understanding the kill chain, which is not a novel topic in security, to your point, where you link up multiple different vulnerabilities or multiple different attack patterns, right? That are profiting from some of these vulnerabilities, definitely I think is not as prevalent in today's threat modeling tools. And so I think it's a missed opportunity. And I think it really doesn't align with contextually what actually happens in real world attacks. When you even do like red teaming or pen testing, you are chaining some of these vulnerabilities together, because you say, well, if I take exploit this vulnerability, this will allow me to do this other vulnerability into the environment. So laterally, or to other parts of the attack surface. So I think it's a gap, and you're 100% correct there. The simple, going back to a little bit of what I said before, and a more simple example, take the OWASP top 10. I'm an OWASP chapter leader for Atlanta, and I'm not knocking the
Okay.
OWASP top 10, but oftentimes, the organizations will say, "Oh yeah, we ran a scan. We saw that 5 of the 10 are vulnerable, and this is our threat," right? Well, it's not. These are, the OWASP top 10 is advertised as top 10 web application vulnerabilities, right? So they're not really a threat yet because you have to qualify, like going back to what you just said, context. What is the likelihood that someone can go into where my affected component is in my application and reach that vulnerable node or vulnerable component in my code base, right? Or in my application. And so we don't have the context of some of the things you mentioned, like countermeasures, architectural layers that are upstream to the affected environment. And I think if you're going to do like a security centric approach, okay, yeah, you don't even care about upstream, downstream mitigation. You just like, this is a security issue. We have non-negotiable on security issues and we have to mitigate as part of the threat model. But in a risk centric approach that says, okay, do we have other upstream mitigations or do we have other environmental conditions that lessen the likelihood of this being exploited? And that provides a more balanced approach to addressing application risks within a model.
Yeah, and a very realistic one. So, but while we are talking about scale and doing the implementation, and we have talked about how context matters and how you can have a threat library, moving on from there, were there any cases where you realized that this cannot be automated definitely? Like there are some special cases where we know for sure that it cannot be automated and should be done manually. Has there ever been that kind of an experience?
Yeah, I think one of the still most valuable activities in threat modeling traditional is, the activity of whiteboarding, how components in an application are communicating. So it's difficult to do that automation, I think, with advancements in like natural language processing, being able to consume, for example, if you're a security champion and you want to be able to effectively get the thoughts of another developer, front end, back end, DevOps engineer on the environment, you maybe, would ask them some certain questions and they could basically relay those questions in a binary voice file. Where, because otherwise, traditionally, what we would do is we would go into, a war room, we would have a huge whiteboard and we would talk about what components are talking to what, under what protocols, under what privilege model, et cetera, right? That takes a lot of time. But I think there's already existing technologies where you can do that same exercise. You can take a picture, right? It's a binary of image file, and then there is technology now that can render that into a DFD, and also provide a standard data format, almost like a XML document, right? Where it creates a tree based upon the values of the image. I think that's going to get better. And I think that's going to get more widely adopted. Right now, those are like niche type of technologies that are not widely used. I think that, the way that we consume information into the threat model will drastically change over the next couple of years, where we traditionally might ask a human something. Now we can have them on their own time, right? Because developers are busy, architects are busy on their own time, describe the call flow or the data flow in an application model, and then that binary voice file to be transcribed and then changed into a standard data format that you could diff over time, or that could be basically visualized through some sort of like, JavaScript visualizer. So I think there's opportunities for that. I don't think that they're quite mainstream yet at all. But I think they're very, very valuable because I think threat modeling is an important activity. And I think that scaling is going to be the major, mountain to overcome.
Yeah, while I was thinking of that, I have sometimes thought about it, especially with recently the LLMs coming in and the way that we are using ML, and eventually when you have large enough data set for large scale organizations where you have the system has visibility into the tech stack, the IT system, the assets, the controls that you have, and if that level of visibility is present, I'm sure it will also be able to figure out the attack trees and be able to have a better context in terms of attacks. But that will be quite interesting to see when products start adding this kind of a feature from a threat perspective.
Yeah, last year I started playing around with this site, a tool called eraser.io. And basically it allows you to describe your, because I mean, I'm looking for ways to automate the building out of the DFD. The DFD is one artifact of threat modeling. Some people think that they build a DFD and they like, I built a threat model. No, you didn't. You built a security schematic design on flows, right? But you still don't, you can't populate all the information in the threat model into a visual diagram because you don't have enough real estate. But this tool, eraser.io, allowed me to describe in simple text, like, what my call flow is across, 10, 15 different components in an application. And then it would build out the DFD for me, right? So going back to my example, imagine you're a security champion in an enterprise and you go through, I don't know, 50 interviews over the course of 3 months. You take those voice files and then you basically convert them to text, and then they can be parsed into, they can be ingested by an interface. Now, of course, the challenge here is confidentiality, right? You don't want to do this. You want to ideally build your own eraser.io right internally, because you don't want all of this like sensitive
For
binary
obvious
files and
reasons.
transcribed information out there on a third party, right? That gets hacked. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Those challenges will always be there. But when we're talking about scale, there are some very non-obvious factors that are there. So when you practically talk about scaling threat modeling, you would either do it through a security program or something that's working at scale for your hundreds of thousands of developers and many products that you have in the organization. There'll be many dependencies while we do that, right? There can be technical dependencies like understanding the different kind of services, third-party services, systems, integrations, and tech stacks. But there is one key aspect of the cultural dependency as well, like not just the development culture, but in general the cultural dependencies uh, in terms of adopting what you're trying to scale. So the scale may have some level of automation, it may have processes, it may have some people specific changes as well while you're trying to get threat modeling at scale. What has been your experience? Can you share some such implementations or projects where you did that for an organization, and what was your learning for the cultural dependencies?
yeah, absolutely. I think the culture is, as they say affectionately with the OSI model, it's like the eighth layer, right? It's like the layer of people that you have to sell a security activity to. And time is what you don't have. So you have to sell the idea of building a threat model for an application against the lack of time that whole entire group has. So how do you do it? Well, in our experience in dealing with very large multinational companies that have upwards of 300, 400 different products, all using different SDLC methodologies, it's going to vary, but overall you want to be able to come up with a promise on what is the amount of threat modeling time that it's going to take you to produce a threat model that they can address into the product. So it's not just the amount of time of going through the threat model. That's one dependency, right? Where you're asking of their time to provide validation on input or to provide information. What you want to do if you want to scale a program is to be able to reduce that as much as possible, or to be able to derive that as much as you can as a security champion. And the reality is, if you are working with, these product teams and you already have access to their Confluence site, you have a lot of insight already in terms of what their methodology is, even related to the application, what the components are doing, what the functions are doing. That mature group development groups will kind of have a wiki on what the product is supposed to do, so you can really plug a lot of that information into your threat model for contextually. What you want to do is to be able to fill in as much of the holes yourself, right? um, Threat intel stage 4 pasta. So to be able to, obviously has nothing to do with a development team, but has everything to do with maybe your SOC or your threat intel group. To be able to self-serve on threat intel so that you can come up with a threat library and give them a product within the time frames that are most, I think, applicable to multinational companies is, anywhere between 2 hours of threat modeling to, maximum like, 8 days, which, for most people that have done threat modeling, it's like, there's no way. How can I do this? Well, you're going to have to pick whatever flavor threat modeling methodology you want and make it to be your own, where you have non-negotiable steps. Part of it might be, I need to bake in, what is my attack surface. Another one might be, I need to rope in threat intel to substantiate my threat library. Another one might be, I want to correlate weaknesses that are in the environment that exacerbate my threats. But from experience, it's 2 hours to about 8 days. Because if you look at a standard software development lifecycle, if you go beyond that, you could be affecting go-to-market strategies. You could be affecting release dates.
Yeah.
And once you start affecting release dates, now you're affecting the business, right? So, realistically, I think what you wanted to be able to do is, if you take something like pasta, look at the stages and say, if you even do one stage, great, start there, right? Come up with your own maturity model for what threat modeling looks like to you and your organization, year one, year two, year three, right? And don't be overly pessimistic about how simplistic your threat model is. The reality is that if you want to scale and make an impact that is sustainable, a lot of times people are like, let me bring in a tool, and then the tool defines the process. I call that the American way of doing security. Where you look at like European and APAC, they're more process driven, right? They're thinking through who's involved. They're thinking through, dependencies, maybe an architectural review board. What are the other processes along the way that either could feed the threat model or that could enforce the threat model, right? Your goal is to build a sustainable threat modeling program. So begin with something that is realistically scalable, understand what the requirements are from the development teams. Is it 2 hours, or is it 8 days, or is it somewhere in between? Once you define what the time frame is, then define what are the activities that you want, that you need to have to build a version one of threat modeling for your organization.
Oh, that's yeah, that's a very nuanced observation that you have, Tony. There, I think there are many things that you said, and I'm just in multiple tangents right now. But starting off with the timelines, I was anyways going to ask you about the timelines. I see that there's a common villain in both offensive and defensive side of the story, specifically in security. But that is the reality today. So we have, for example, if we have a 2 week sprint and we have a bunch of features from the development team that you want to roll out, and now somebody comes and tells you that you will use one of the weeks for threat modeling and finding threats and figuring things out, so that's a very direct impact on the release itself, because everything is automated now, and that means that features are not going in, releases are not happening, and you're hurting business directly. So it makes a lot of sense to break it down, simplify it further, because so having run some of these programs myself at scale, it's exactly the same experience that I've had. The simpler it is, the easier it is to adopt, and for all the teams to adapt with it, have simpler processes, make it as lean as possible and as digestible as possible, so that they can do it alongside their development and not take it like a separate thing, like pen testing used to be at a time. The moment it is separate, it starts looking like, a different set of security things to do, which becomes like non-functional in their view. So this brings in a lot of, I would say, adoption and acceptance from the development teams if this approach is followed. And then, as I understand what you're saying, we can go stage by stage, and gradually, as they mature, we can add in more and more, depending on what stage they are in.
Absolutely. What you want, just practically speaking, when you're building out your threat modeling program in your organization, is you want those wins, right? First, you begin with your friendlies. In any organization, you have those development teams that they just hate you. Okay, they don't like to be around you, and they, whatever you do altruistically, they don't care for it. Don't start with them. Start with the friendly development teams that
Yeah.
you want to introduce a threat modeling program that is a version one and has some core features that is within that time span, that is realistic and that provides meaningful value to them. What developers want to know, I've been a developer, and what developers want to know is what they want to know when they develop software. They want to know from the business, what features do you want me to build? Okay, give me the requirements. Great. Same thing with security. What are the threats that I need to know so I can try to mitigate that in my software? And the architects can say, I can mitigate that architecturally in design, or engineers can mitigate that, in terms of preemptive hardening in the environment. So if as long as you address those things, and that's the goal, right? The goal shouldn't be that you build a threat modeling program so that you can show off and say, I'm a threat modeling person. No, that's not the goal. The goal is so that you can build meaningful value back to your internal customers, right? That is definitely the goal.
Yeah, and talking of value, I remember from initially when I was just starting to run some of these programs, and we were brainstorming on, given that the stages were running well, our pilots had run pretty well, and then it was a time when we were looking at phase two, phase three of the program when we were maturing it. It was time to also think of what can we measure. Now threat modeling being threat modeling, it is different. Threats are different from vulnerabilities, as many of us in security understand. But when you start executing that on ground and start finding your respective threats and addressing them as well, there would come a time, especially for security teams or security leadership and even engineering leadership, where you're talking about how threats are reducing from time to time. Yeah. So, from the perspective of measurement, I wanted to know, what should we measure as a part of the process?
I think a key one that's simple to measure is what sort of issues, when you go through threat modeling early in the design or pre-development stages, if you find an issue, you saved a lot of time, right? Because if you think about traditional security where post implementation of a solution into production or into an environment, you find the issue, and then what do you have to do? You have to remediate it in N+1 version of that code base, right, or that environment. And so you have to patch something, or you have to change the code base and fix it. If you can find a flaw that's obviously going to be a true positive, and you get concerted agreement that, hey, this is an issue, and it actually maps to a threat in your threat library, this is one of those, like, I mean, I don't like prideful moments because it's such a bad, quality, but it's one of those moments where you can basically hang your hat up on and say, you know what, as a security champion, I thought this through and I brought this team together to see a design issue, a permission issue, a configuration issue that actually substantiates a threat in my threat library. The key thing here is that one metric is, did I define a threat library that makes sense to my stakeholders? I think that's a key metric where the stakeholders are like, yes, we do not want these threats to happen. Great. That is a milestone. Next is like, did you find something with earlier on in the SDLC where it didn't have to, go to production. It didn't have to go through remediation queues. It was found during the design or development phase, right? Or pre-development phase. And so that is a great metric, right? Because you're saving so much time. The amount of time it takes to do remediation. So there's remediation management, that takes time. There's remediation queues, right? Where the developer has to stop what they're doing on N+2, the next version of a great product that you're working on. They have to go back, right, to a current deployed model of N minus
Yeah.
whatever, and they have to fix that. That's not where you're making your promises of features that your customer wants. You're having to go back, right? That takes a lot of time. You can unitize that and say, we just saved 5 hours, 10 hours, 20 hours, then that's actual money, right? Being able
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
understand how you're saving time, those are some simple metrics where you can basically hang your hat on and really, present that to, senior level executives and those that are sponsoring threat modeling in your organization.
Yeah. I think there are very, very far-reaching effects of what you're talking about. I think when, in the long term, it really helps when you have reduced these timelines, rather than mindlessly throwing threats at the developers, understanding what it takes to remediate, having the right quality of threats from time to time, having all of that as a part of the metric gives, I think, a little more accurate picture of the actual risk that might be there, but also at the same time looking at how to make it sustainable. there were a few things we were thinking of which were in similar lines, including the recovery time and stuff that you talked about, the remediation timelines and all of that. But we were also thinking, of what are the metrics in terms of the behavioral change that we have brought about in the developers. So there's one thing that you can say that the number of threats are high, or they will go down over a period of time. But the idea is that how iteratively are you actually picking up a bunch of features and doing threat modeling. So that was one of the things that we were looking at, which was quite eye-opening, because having that as a part of the process and having that in your muscle memory, like if you are doing agile development, you have a quick set of features, you just get into a room, do whiteboarding, it becomes a part of the process, and it defines how much you are actually thinking about security. So in some cases you would know that once you define a metric, there is a risk of teams trying to achieve that metric. Like for example, with vulnerabilities going down, you may have threats that they either are discovering lesser threats because now they don't want to be in the limelight where they're accountable for many threats or remediations, but rewarding them for following that instinct of doing the threat modeling in the first place. So how frequently are they doing threat modeling also matters, because now it's become a part of the process, which was more important than the threat itself in many cases.
Absolutely. I think you just mentioned a diamond nugget for everyone on listening in, because, you know, the threat modeling, unlike other activities in security, provides a collaborative and educational aspect to it, where it can actually change perception and behavior, to your point. And, definitely that is a bigger metric than chasing metrics related to, threat reduction, threat identification metrics, and things like that. Still important, all those metrics are. But when you get to basically get developers and architects to now think about, wait, how is this going to affect my threat model with their own words, right? With their own form of thinking within their own respective, circles in the architectural review board or stand-ups in development meetings. Then now you're fostering change, right? And that becomes cultural, and that becomes a lot more sustainable. Because when you have product teams now begin to use the same vernacular of like, wait, will this change? Does it require me to reevaluate my threat model on your own, versus having to be helicopter parented by the security champion who may go on vacation, may not be available, might be looking at other products. But if you can basically create a culture where they're thinking about their threat model and how that's reshaping how they're designing, how they're configuring, how they're patching, how they're, hardening, how they're doing everything with related to product management, that I think is so much more important. And it's a golden point that you mentioned.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I think there have been a lot of dimensions that we have touched in this episode, starting from an individual application to how we scale it up, what does automation mean, the futuristic aspect of LLMs as well, and then the idea and then importance of the qualitative metrics and being able to measure correctly for something as subjective as threat modeling, and be able to do that at scale. So thanks a lot for answering all these questions and patiently for us. And thanks for being on the show today.
Oh, my pleasure, Nilu. This was great. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for having me. Been a big honor.
Yeah, hoping for more such episodes with you in future as well.
Absolutely. Anytime, I'll be available.
Thanks everyone for watching this episode. We will see you all in the next episode. Bye-bye. Hey y'all, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to Breakpoint Security Podcast. Your support means that we can bring more such conversations back to you. Share with your friends and colleagues and stay tuned for more episodes from Breakpoint. Until then, bye-bye.